Hello, class. In this module, we're going to cover cranking systems or starting systems, as most people will call them. Okay, so the first thing in a starting system that is needed is the starter motor. So the starter motor itself, it's only about the size of, say, I would say like a cell phone, maybe like a football, somewhere in that range. It's not huge, it's not gigantic, okay? Maybe like two baseballs, put together. That's about the size of a starter motor, all right? And the starter motor, the only purpose of the starter motor is to start the vehicle, and that's it. It does not do anything else. In modern vehicles, though, however, if you have a automatic start-stop system, the starter motor will start the vehicle from a stop. So some vehicles, if you've noticed, you may get in some modern vehicles, they'll have a little A with a circle around it with an arrow, and that symbol on the dash somewhere, or maybe on like a button, will indicate that it has an automatic start stop feature. So what that does is when the vehicle comes to a stop at a stop sign or stop light, the engine will shut off. The interior of the vehicle, all the lights and everything still work. Everything still works. And as long as your foot is still on the brake, the engine will stay off. It won't be idling. But as soon as you let off the brake and go to put your foot on the gas pedal, then the engine kicks on right away and the starter motor engages at that point and just to turn the engine on, back on. Okay. For the most part, starter motors on most vehicles are just used to start the vehicle in the beginning. You drive around and then we shut it off and you turn it back on. That's when it's used again. Okay. So it's not used all the time, but is very important, obviously, extremely important for it to be able to work. We need to get for the engine to be able to work. So we need to get the engine turning in order to get fuel in ignition and air into the engine for it to keep running by itself. Okay. So a starter motor only produces about 0.5 to 2.6, as this says here, horsepower. All right. It's not a lot compared to an engine. A gas engine, just a normal four-cylinder engine nowadays, naturally aspirated, should produce around 150 horsepower, something like that. So we're only talking a couple of horsepower. We're talking, 1 to 2 to maybe up to 2.5 horsepower. That's it. And that's all that's really needed to get the engine moving. Okay. On some vehicles, we do have a push button start. Okay. If we have a push button start vehicle, there's no ignition in the traditional sense where you put the key in and you turn the key. Okay. Most cars are going to go to a push button start at some point if they haven't already. Keys, traditional mechanical keys will eventually go away, or they won't go away fully, but they'll be used as they are in some of modern vehicles where it's an emergency feature. You could always have a manual way to get in the car, and that's with the key, the physical key. You have to take off the little cap on the outside on your handle and put the key in there, and then turn it manually. But you would have to take that physical key out of usually within the key fob itself. Okay, the push start systems, they use the PCM to crank the engine. So the button that you push is an input. If we go back to computers, and we talked about computers in previous modules, the input is the signal that is given to the control module. In this case, it could be the PCM, which means powertrain control module, or it could be the ECM, which means engine control module. Now we push the button, that's the input. So you yourself are the input because you're pushing the button. You're sending a signal to the ECM or PCM to crank the engine. The PCM will take that input, process the information, send that information to the starter motor itself, which has a solenoid on it. If we go back to the previous slide, you see the solenoid on top of it. Okay. The solenoid will then, I'm going to circle the solenoid. The solenoid will then energize, and give power to the motor, which will turn the engine at that point. Okay. So the solenoid on the starter motor is the output. Okay. So we have a push button input. That's you pushing the button, sending the signal to the ECM or PCM. PCM then commanding the starter motor solenoid to energize and give power, cranking the engine and pushing the gear out onto the flywheel. Okay. In most vehicles, well, I should say all vehicles have a neutral safety switch. So if you've ever get in your car, try to get in your car and go and start your vehicle. You can only start your vehicle in two of the gears that are available. So you have a P, you have R, you have N, and you have D. And then you may have like a 1, 2, 3, or you may have like a shift, a plus, minus, something like that. But your P is for park, your R is for neutral, your R is for reverse, your N is for neutral, and your D is for drive. Okay. You can only start your vehicle in P or N on an automatic transmission vehicle. Okay. If you don't have an automatic transmission, you have a manual transmission vehicle. The only way you're supposed to be able to start your vehicle is just the clutch safety switch. Now, the manual transmission vehicles, when you push on the clutch, that's when you engage, or I should say disengage, the safety switch, which allows you to start the vehicle. Okay. You'll get the signal then at that point. So, manual transmission, you have to push in the clutch, and that'll give a signal to the ECM or the transmission control module or whatever you have, that the engine is okay to start. If not, if you have an automatic transmission vehicle, you have to have it in park or neutral. Then you can turn the ignition switch or push the button, and then that'll indicate to the engine control module or powertrain control module that the vehicle is okay to start. Okay. If there's if there's a problem with one of these switches, the symptom is the vehicle won't crank. Okay, so you can do anything you want. You can go and you can turn the ignition switch. You can put your foot down on the clutch pedal, move the gears around. Then nothing happens. The engine just it will not crank. The lights will come on and the radio will work, the AC will work, stuff like that will work as far as like the blower motor, and the lights will work on the dash. But the engine won't crank. So that would be the symptom if one of these switches went bad. Okay. Key fob. The only thing, I mean, I think everyone's seen a key fob. This is I think a General Motors key fob. Um, I think most people know what most of these are. I mean, we know what the lock is. We know what the lock is, and we know what the unlock is. This one is pretty obvious. These two down here for the trunk, if you have an SUV to open the trunk, okay, push and hold those. And then everyone, I hope, has seen the red panic button, so that will just set off your alarm. The one thing that some people may not have seen or don't know about just yet, because maybe they haven't seen a modern vehicle just yet, is the one on top. So this one here, this symbol here, that is your auto start stop. So what you can do is when you're away from the vehicle and you want to start it, you have to be within some sort of range, unless you have an app on your phone that can start it. But with this key fob that we're looking at here, you have to be, I think, within, I'm guessing within, say, 30, 40 feet, somewhere around there. Maybe a little bit further, but you have to push and hold. But usually you have to lock the car first. So usually lock the car, you press that twice, the lock button twice, you'll hear the beep of the horn or the alarm. Then you can push and hold the button on top. The button on top with this circle with an arrow, that button will start the vehicle then at that point. Okay. So that way, what it does, the purpose of it is so you can keep the AC going, as you come to the vehicle, it may be hot outside, and the vehicle can be somewhat cooler than it is when you just get in without starting the vehicle previously. Okay. On other modern vehicles, if you have an app on your phone that's connected to your car, then you can start your vehicle that way through data connection. So you could be anywhere technically, as long as you have a data connection and your vehicle has a data connection. You can start the car anywhere you want. I actually have that on my car, and I can start if my car's in a different city. I can start my car or lock it or unlock it or turn the AC on, stuff like that. Okay, and that'll come to most cars. I think all cars eventually. The way the starter motor works, so it uses magnetism. I don't want to get too in depth into this because, it's okay. It's good to understand how it works, but it's just as important, if not more important, to understand how to diagnose it or how to find out if it's bad or not. Because we don't rebuild starter motors anymore. Uh, we just buy them from a parts store or from the dealership, and we put them in. We take the old one out. We send it back. Someone else will rebuild them if they can be rebuilt. So for us here, the way a starter motor works, there's a couple different types of starter motors, but it's going to use electromagnetism. Okay, we've talked about that previously, just so everyone's aware of it. So electromagnetism is how it works. What we're going to do is we're going to create two opposing magnetic fields. Now the picture here, I know it might be a little difficult to follow along, but we have magnetic fields on the outside and we have magnetic fields on the inside. So the magnetic fields on the outside are stable. They're just there. They can be permanent magnets or it can be energized through electricity. And then there's a magnetic field on the inside. Now, the one on the inside, that's the portion that turns. So when we actually rotate the motor, that's the part that's actually turning. These two parts do not touch. The outside portion where we see the poles, so the outside, I'm going to draw on this a little bit. The outside here where we see the N and the S, north and south poles, those areas do not touch the inside areas at all. They're very, very close to each other, but they do not touch. Okay. And what we do is we create a magnetic field on the outside and on the inside. One is, if we use permanent magnets, the magnetic field is always there, but we can energize the opposing one. We can energize the interior one, so to say, and we can create these two magnetic fields. One is going to be weaker than the other. And then once we have two opposing magnetic fields, what they're going to want to do is move away from each other. Okay, kind of like when we put a North Pole and a North Pole together, they want to move away. So it's going to move away by spinning. Okay, as it's spinning, it's moving away from the opposing magnetic field, the one it doesn't like. Okay, and that'll spin the motor and turn it, and that's how all electric motors work. You know, on a basic level. Now, if we want to go ahead and read this, you know, look through this, you can pause it here and read through this. But if we want to make the magnetic field stronger, that'll give us more power in the electric in the turning of the electric motor, which will again turn the engine a little bit quicker. Okay, I don't want to go over all the theory behind it too much. You can go ahead and read about that in the textbook as well. And same thing here. Again, if we want to make, you know, there's different ways to make magnetism stronger or weaker to be able to rotate things. But go ahead again and pause it here, write this down. This may be on a quiz. Okay. Now, as the starter motor rotates faster, less current is drawn from the battery. Okay, that's kind of might sound kind of weird, but let's think about this. So when any electric motor turns, it's drawing current, which is amperage. So it's removing electricity from the battery. Okay. But it removes the most electricity at the beginning. So think of it. So when you physically, I'm sure everyone's probably pushed a car in their lifetime, right? So when you, because a car broke down or something, you ran out of gas, whatever the reason is, but you have to push the car. So if the car is on a flat road, you have to push it. When is it hardest to push? Is it hardest to push in the beginning when it first starts, or once you get the car going? So it's definitely harder to push in the beginning at it from a dead stop. If the car is at a dead stop and you go and try and push it, it's going to be much harder at that point than it is once you get it going. You'll still be using your strength and your energy to keep it going, but not as much from the initial start of it. It's the same thing for a starter motor, any electric motor, from a dead stop, because the engine is not moving at all. It's at 0 RPM. The starter motor is going to draw a lot of amperage from the battery to get the engine rotating. As soon as it starts to rotate, then there's going to be less current and less current used as it keeps going. Okay, and by that point, the ignition system and the fuel system and the air coming in the engine will have taken over at that point, and the engine will just run by itself with those other items that won't need the starter motor anymore. Okay. The other thing I want to draw your attention on this picture here is you'll notice that the portion on the inside, which is called the armature, is not touching the portion on the outside. Okay, which is where the stator is. Okay, so the outside we have a magnetic field, and the inside we have a magnetic field. But remember, they are opposing. Okay, they want to get away from each other. That's why we're looking at these arrows here. All right, and that's what causes the motor to spin itself. But again, they do not touch. There's an air gap in between there. Okay. If you ever hear a starter motor whine, so it makes a high pitched noise, that is coming from the gears. Um, gears, the gear is inside of the starter motor. It pops out, connects to the flywheel, and turns. Okay, so that's normal. So don't worry about it. All right. If it gets really, really loud, that might be okay. Yeah, the starter motor might be going bad. Not necessarily the gears are bad or anything like that, but you know that's something you'd want to check. But usually that doesn't happen very often. Now, we could, I think I mentioned this already, but we could, instead of using a magnetic field on the outside created through electricity, we can just use permanent magnets that are always magnetized at all times, that are on the outside. And that way, the magnetic field is there. We don't have to apply electricity to it. It's already there. We just apply electricity to the inside, to the armature, and that'll get the motor to spin. Okay, because when the armature is there, it's just a pack of windings. It's just metal, and there's no electricity in it. Um, there's no electromagnetism inside of the windings if they're just sitting there doing nothing. We have to give it electricity, then it creates a magnetic field. Okay. And again, some of these are just pictures for your FYI. So go ahead and pause it or go back to the PowerPoint, which is available to you online, so you can see them. Okay, and examine it a little bit more. Maybe read at the top what it says. Okay. Now, the starter motor, because the starter motor is so small, this is a picture of a blown up starter motor, kind of like a cutaway diagram. Because the starter motor is so small, it spins a lot faster than your regular engine. And spec wise, we're talking, 15, 16, 18, 20 times faster than an engine, depending on the size of the starter motor, depending on the size of the engine, right? Okay, so this is just kind of FYI for you guys. And again, take your time, go and pause it or go back to the PowerPoint and look at this diagram and kind of see how the starter motor is designed in a way. Um, there is, if anyone's ever had a bad starter motor, the symptom of a bad starter motor is that the engine will not crank. This doesn't crank and won't start. That's more of a battery issue. It will just won't crank. Nothing will happen. You turn the key or you push the button and nothing happens. You don't hear anything. You may hear a click and that's it. That's all you may hear. So that's the symptom of a bad starter motor. Now, in the past, a lot of people have said, "Hey, grab something, grab like a piece of wood or a pry bar or a broomstick or anything, and hit the starter motor while you're cranking it." That can work, especially the starter motor is going bad, and it may have gotten in a spot where the magnetic field is not strong enough anymore to get it to turn. But by you hitting it, you vibrate it and you turn it just enough, just a half a millimeter, and then the starter motor actually starts. It actually turns and gets it going. It may work that one time, and it may work for another day or two, but then it's going to go bad eventually again, and you may have to do that again. You can only do that so many times until the starter motor just quits. Okay, but that is one way that you can, get yourself out of a pinch, at least get yourself home, and then you can change the starter motor. If you have that symptom where you turn the key or push the button and it just clicks and nothing happens, that could be a starter motor issue. I'm not saying it is, but it could be. And you can hit the starter motor. Usually, you want to hit it with something like wooden, like use a broomstick or the back of a pry bar handle. Don't use something metal because the starter motors are made out of metal. And what this picture is showing here is that if you hit it too hard or hit it too much, the magnets that are inside of the starter motor, they can be damaged. Okay, and that's what this is showing here. Now, there are something called gear reduction starter motors. So gear reduction starter motors are they are let's see, used on engines that usually have high compression ratios, and they are smaller in size. That's really like the reason to use it. Take up less space. So instead of having the starter motor go directly out and connecting to the flywheel, you'll notice that this picture, the motor is actually on top. Usually the motor connects to the flywheel directly, but in here it's not. Okay, so usually the motor is so here's our flywheel. I'm gonna circle the flywheel. So that's where the flywheel would be, and that's what's connected to the engine, right? Usually the motor is in line with it, so it's down here, and it's connected directly with it, okay? But in this picture here, it is not. So what this means is that we have gears up top. So we have the starter motor at the very top. I'm gonna circle the starter motor, okay? And then we have a gear that comes out. That's the starter motor gear. But then we have other gears here, and then another gear here. Then it finally connects to the crankshaft or to the flywheel. Okay, so by doing this, so we have one gear into another gear into another gear. So we have an added gear in between. This is our added gear. Usually it's just direct, but this time it's not. We have an added gear. So what this does is creates more torque. Think of a truck. So when you want a truck, you want to be able to tow things or pull things. In the rear end of a truck and where the axle is, the gears are way different than compared to a car. If you had a rear-wheel drive car and a rear-wheel drive truck, the gears are completely different because the gears in the back of a truck are made for towing, made for pulling a lot of torque. The gears in the back of a car are made for speed to maintain, so they'll get a higher speed on the freeway. So those are the differences, and we use gears to be able to create this, okay, to create this type of gear reduction and more increased torque. And so starter motors are designed that way as well, and they can do that. And then when the starter motor comes out of the gear, this is just showing that it connects onto the flywheel. Okay. So the starter motor has a gear at the end of it. It'll come out at the same time that it's turning, and it'll turn the flywheel. Okay. And there is a ratio to it. I won't get into too much of the ratios. If you want to learn about gear ratios, the manual transmission class has talks about that a lot, and gear ratios and stuff. Okay. And then this is just, again, specification. If you want to go ahead and stop the video and write some of this down or look at it, feel free to do so. But our normal cranking speed is about 200 RPM. Okay, that's what we're looking at. So it's not high because our normal engine idle speed is roughly around 700, 800 RPMs. Okay, so this is actually pretty low, but that is enough to get the engine started, to get it moving, rotating, and then the ignition, fuel, etc. takes over. Now, this is more for when you're actually in lab. If you ever take a lab class and you actually want to test some of the starters, we got to have a hold and winding and pull and winding. So the hold and winding and pull and winding, meaning they're referring to is the gear that kicks out. There's a solenoid that applies power to the motor, or creates the path, I should say, of power to get to the motor. The solenoid also kicks out the gear. Okay, so see this arm here. There's an arm right here. It's all in blue. I'm trying to, hopefully you can see that, but it's all in blue here. But the starter motor kicks out. Here's the arm, and it kicks out this gear, and this gear is what's going to connect to the flywheel, which is going to be down here. Okay, so as the gear kicks out, there's windings that hold it because you're going to give it energy, and we got to hold it out. Then we got to let it come back in too as well, because we can't leave the gear out there all the time because it's going to spin the starter motor once the engine starts. It kicks out, turns the flywheel, which turns the motor, then it comes back in. Okay. So we're just talking about these windings, and we can test them. We can do a couple tests, some voltage drop tests, to find out if they're working properly or not. Okay. And that's what this is referring to here. Okay, and I think I've already talked about this, but you can go ahead and pause or write some of this down if you like. Defective starter motor, no crank, no start, which means push the button or turn the key and nothing happens. You may hear a click, but that's it. That's all you're going to hear. You're not going to necessarily hear the engine crank. If you hear the engine cranking, that's not a starter motor. The starter motor is working. There's other problems. There's a fuel problem, an ignition problem, a battery problem. There's something else wrong, but it's not the starter motor. The starter motor symptom is no crank, no start. So nothing happens. It's just silence. Okay. When you're turning the ignition switch. Okay. And there is an animation that you can look at. There's no audio to it. I think there's just music. But you can go ahead and look at this when you get a chance. Okay. I'm not going to show it here because you can always see that later. All right. So hopefully you've learned something today. If you have any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me. Okay. Thank you very much.